Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, sponsored by Ave Maria University. I'm your host, Michael Dauphinais, and today I'm joined by colleague and professor of communications, Justin Bonanno. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me here.
Well, we're so glad to have you on our show today, and you've really dedicated a lot of your scholarly life to studying not only communications and rhetoric, but specifically Walker Percy.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think many of our listeners and viewers may not know much about Walker Percy. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I hope today is that they'll get to know him a little bit and maybe know why you love him so much. Sure. And why you find his insights so helpful. So maybe just to start with, what is it about Walker Percy? What does he kind of identify as the kind of peculiar, the peculiar problem, in a way, of our contemporary age? Mm-hmm. And how does he think that Christianity kind of uniquely addresses it?
Sure. So first of all, thanks again for having me here. Percy, I wish more people knew about Walker Percy. Most people who do know him as a novelist. But he also wrote philosophical essays. He wrote a manuscript-length work that was hitherto unpublished. It was released in 2019, called Symbol and Existence. And he was a philosopher who was very interested in symbols and signs. And it's important to understand, in order to understand Percy and his sort of importance for our historical moment, his background. So he came from the South. He was a Southerner, and he had a long history of tragedy in his family. So his father had committed suicide, his grandfather had committed suicide, and his mother, some had speculated that she had also committed suicide. So when this happened, he went to go live with his uncle Will, and he was kind of brushing shoulders with these literary giants in the South. As he continued to grow up, he went to study medicine. He was studying to become a medical doctor.
Yes.
And he got tuberculosis while dissecting a cadaver. And as he was recovering in Saranac Lake, New York, he began to read philosophy. He began to read Aquinas, to debate with his friend, actually, because he wasn't a Catholic at the time. So he's like, might as well read, Aquinas. And after a period of time, he just gave up the practice of medicine, although he had a great appreciation for science, and he started to write novels and started to write philosophical essays. But the key problem of our time that I think he addresses is scientism. So the idea that science, as we understand it today, sort of empirical verification, is going to yield the only true knowledge.
Yes.
And he also, the flip side of scientism is identity politics. So this sort of obsessive preoccupation with the self and one's individual sort of identity. And his way of looking at symbols is a way of looking at how symbols confer knowledge, a la science, and how we know the world through symbols. But also how, if we're not careful or not attentive to the limits of symbols, we can begin to say, well, I am this or I am that, and we begin to apply symbols to ourselves and give them a higher degree of reality than they actually deserve. So he gives people a sort of interpretive toolkit. He gives us a way of making sense of the appeal of scientism, and also the appeal of that you find a lot in these sort of preoccupations with individual identity.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of, I think, one of his lines from, I guess it's in, I think it's in Love in the Ruins, but he kind of has this little bit of an apocalyptic American future in which the left and the right go to war with each other, and just everything kind of falls apart, but no one seems to care that much, right? But he has at one point where he says, I think it's the Widening Gyre from Keats, where he ends up saying something like, the center did not hold, but the GDP continued to rise. And just this sense that we become so, because we're somehow, as he puts it, like we become lost in the cosmos, one of his books, we become like there's something, we live amidst the ruins of a culture, and we kind of therefore like we fall into this, like we only find identity through some kind of false ascription of language, as you put it, that that kind of loses touch with reality. So could you say a little bit more about about how what is his understanding of language, and how does he think this kind of helps us to overcome maybe the isolation or the collectivism that's so common today?
Yeah, so it's a great question. The Lost in the Cosmos, he has what's called the semiotic primer of the self, which is just this little sliver in the middle of Lost in the Cosmos. And basically there's this funny little, preface to that section where he's like, you could skip this if you want, it's not important. But it's like the most important part of the book. And he actually alluded at one point in time, he said, if people remember me, however many years in the future, it's probably going to be for this. And it's his understanding of how the sort of semiotic event or the linguistic event is different from other types of phenomena in the cosmos.
And just to kind of maybe for listeners who, or for myself, so when you say like the semiotic event, the linguistic event as an event in the cosmos, are you describing like the birth of language, that all of a sudden we have now beings in the cosmos that speak words to one another, and this sense of the birth of language?
So the example he always goes back to is the anecdote of Helen Keller, first learning language. And she has her one hand under the water spigot, and she's outside. And then she has Anne Sullivan in her other hand, spelling out the word water. And she comes to the sudden realization after she does this a number of times that this liquid flowing over her hand is this thing over here. There's this relationship, but also identity between our words for things and the things themselves. And so unlike other creatures that are sort of biologically adapted perhaps to respond to the environment, a la stimulus and response, this thing happens, then this thing happens, we're oriented towards the world as knowers. We want to know what things are. And this, he says, is unique to human beings as creatures that deal in signs. And it's also something that you can observe in everyday life with children, right? Small children as they're learning language. So I have a 1-year-old, a 3-year-old, and it's amazing watching them learn how to speak. Because when you read a book, oftentimes with my daughter, it's a picture book. She's pointing at things. She's going, what is it?
Yeah.
What is it? What is it? And she wants to know what the names of things are. But the names of things confer knowledge. They help us to know things. So we don't know the world directly as angels do. I think it's Frederick Wilhelmsen who Percy draws upon. He says we kind of sidle up against existence, and we sidle up against existence, and we know it through symbols. The most common of which is the spoken word. It's the most economical symbol. And human beings, we're the only creatures that babble. We go through this lolling stage, right? We're just making noises. But somehow, it's this mysterious event, the noises, the sounds that we're making sort of catch on fire. They take flight and they become meaningful for us.
Wow, yeah.
So he's really interested in the phenomenon of meaning, what makes things meaningful, what makes things meaningless. How did things lose their meaning?
Yeah.
And then you could begin to see how his sort of ideas about language, about symbols, can begin to play into Christian apologetic.
Yeah. And so what I understand in a little bit is, in a way, right, we say like a child sees a dog, a child sees the environment, the child begins to distinguish among the environment, but when the child begins to label, that's a dog, the child understands more about the dog because now it begins to attach this broader frame of reference, in a certain sense, this accumulation of meaning and wisdom within words that comes about by our ability to name the world around us. And I think that what I also pick up on what you're saying is that Percy's doing this because he's fully aware that in a world of kind of scientism, we tend to assume that anything that is not scientifically, empirically verifiable, that you can't measure on a scale and repeat in an experiment, is just mere relativism and subjectivism.
Right.
So moral truths, ethical truths, religious truths are often seen within a contemporary view of scientism as, you know, that's your opinion, but largely they're not ultimately real. And so could you say just a little bit more to make sure that we really catch that? How is it that he thinks that this understanding of, say, symbol, sign, and language begins to break down the kind of illusion of relativism?
Yeah, so obviously science does tell us something about the world, right? That's something he's always at pains to do in his critique of scientism, is to save science. He was a medical doctor. He's like, if I'm sick, I'm not going to not take penicillin. I'm going to take penicillin, you know, if I have some sort of infection. But this is kind of where he follows the Danish theologian and philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who was critiquing the idealism at his time, is he says basically the scientists can understand everything, can know everything in the cosmos, except what it means to live and to die and to essentially be a human being. So like, you know, what does it mean to be an individual in a predicament? And ultimately, what is the predicament that we're in? Well, it's twofold. First of all, everybody we know and love are going to die. So we're facing sort of our existential finitude. We're facing the end. And we have to kind of like prepare for that, or we can try and ignore it, right? But and there are all sorts of ways of trying to divert ourselves. But there's also, as it pertains to the way that he is trying to talk about our predicament, is what he calls the semiotic existential predicament. I know that's a crazy...
So the semiotic existential predicament. It's like supercalifragilistic.
Exactly.
No, kidding. So the semiotic, though, existential, the semiotic, right, has to do with signs and language, right? So this predicament that we're in of our own questioning, of our own trying to find meaning and existence, right, is somehow shaped through language.
Right. Well, yeah, so it's everything is something, right? Everything has a name. And this is a game I kind of play with my students, and some get really upset with me, and I kind of have to qualify what I mean. But I say, can you tell me anything that doesn't have a name? And they'll say, well, what about the unknown? Well, what's it called? Well, it's the unknown. Or what about the gaps? There's gaps in knowledge. There's things we haven't discovered yet. It's like, oh yeah, that's the undiscovered. Those are the gaps, right? We have names even for the things that we don't know.
Yeah.
And so everything has a name. We perceive everything as something. But then the question, and this gets at the semiotic existential predicament, is everything is something, but who or what am I? What's my sort of name? So I have my own like personal name, and people, you know, it's a funny phenomenon. I'll ask students this too. I'm like, do you ever Google yourself? You ever Google your name? Who exactly has your exact name? Why do you do that? Do other animals do that? Are you any different from other animals? Are they Googling themselves? Well, they don't have Google. But, you know, we're not just, you know, my proper name. And I can also think about my titles for myself, right? So I'm a father, I'm a teacher. I like to think that I'm a writer or a scholar. I'm a Catholic. I am this, I am that. But then there's ultimately something mysterious about our own personhood and the personhood of others. And that's what he really wants us to be attentive to, is that particularity, the existential particularity of others, the otherness of others. He wants to draw our attention to that. And there are various strategies that he tries to get us to do that. And then ultimately God, the existential actuality of God, not the idea of God per se, but God in himself and our encounter with him.
Yeah, so when we talk about that idea of we're so used to kind of encountering things in the world, and we're confident as moderns of the scientific ability to explore them, to master them, to know them. And yet, right, we have this question, who are we? Right, that like, what am I? Who made me? These are kind of these questions that are not obvious,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because we're somehow in ourselves discovering. There was a Stephen Barr, who's a Catholic physicist at the University of Delaware, who writes a lot on issues of theology and science, will often say, right, that at least in his world, he's a physicist, but the physicists are so good, and they've been good for so long at seeing what's in front of their eyes that they forget what's behind their eyes, right? What is the I that I am, right? That I, and so how do we, like, how does Percy say we begin to understand ourselves?
So, I mean, ultimately, he converts to the Catholic faith. He thinks, what's the how do we understand what we're supposed to do, or what our meaning in life here? Well, it's very simple. It's to know, love, and serve God. It's just right at the very beginning of the Catechism.
Yes.
It's like, but how do you convince people of that? How do you get people to listen to that? How do you yourself sort of be like, okay, I believe in this, but am I really knowing God? Am I really loving God? Am I really serving God? And that's where he sort of gets into his sort of tactics and his strategies of trying to renew or refresh language. So I think he draws upon Friedrich Nietzsche, who talks about sort of languages wearing smooth like poker chips. So like God and grace and love and sin, like these are all important words, and they express important concepts, and they're so important, right, to living the spiritual life. But ultimately, they're so overused that they kind of wear thin. They become cheapened or profane through overuse. So, for example, he's like, love. What's the answer to all this? Well, love. But love is the way that sitcoms and soap operas are concluded all the time. Or, the way that we talk about our food. It's like, oh, I love hamburgers, and I love this, and I love fishing, and I love my wife. It's like, well, what does the word sort of love mean? So, following the psalmist, he says we need to sing a new song. That's what he's always trying to do with his novels, is he's trying to refresh or revivify language. And for him, the point of art, and he's an artist, he's a novelist, he's also a philosopher, is to, in the words of the Russian literary critic Viktor Shklovsky, is to make the stone stony again, so that it appears again. It doesn't fall away from our awareness. So when you point out to a child, that's a sparrow, that's what it is, and then they go, oh, that's what it is, that's a sparrow, right? Yeah. But in time, as we grow up, we become accustomed to it. We go, that's just a sparrow, that's just a rock, that's just this, that's just a crucifix, that's just a church, that's just a priest, so on and so forth. Yeah. So how do you shake people out of that sort of taken for grantedness? Yeah. His whole thing was to basically, he would try and shock people. If you've read his novels, he's trying to shock people. One thing he sort of constantly points out is the way that catastrophe and trial actually, the technical term he uses is defamiliarize, or makes things strange. So we take things for granted, but then, you have in one of Tolstoy's novels, the soldier wounded on the battlefield, like discovering his hand for the first time, or when people are in some sort of catastrophic situation, it becomes more real. The sort of, I can't help but use the philosophical term, the ontological significance, it becomes more real. Right?
I love that language of defamiliarization. It's interesting. G.K. Chesterton in The Everlasting Man at the beginning describes that sense that kind of, he thinks of England especially, but you could kind of say the West is so familiar with Christianity that it just assumes that it knows what it says, without ever actually thinking about it for more than 5 seconds, right? It's just the familiarity that breeds both contempt and, ironically, ignorance, right? And I think sometimes you can even think about this. Sometimes it's like, I think people within a family maybe sometimes, feel less understood by fellow family members than all of a sudden a friend or a romantic partner who, for the first time, understands them and thinks like, oh, they're important. And so how do we kind of recover, like when we recognize that we've become that we've become overly familiar with reality and overly familiar with these claims of Christianity? Are there any things that maybe that Percy or that you might suggest that we can do to, to defamiliarize ourselves and to kind of reacquaint ourselves with wonder. It's interesting that one of my mentors, Father Matthew Lamb, would often say, if you want to understand what's the natural light of the intellect, right? It's not just that children ask, what is it? But you really begin to see when they start asking, why? Why, Daddy? Why? Why? Why is the sky blue, right? And it's not only do we want to know what something is, we want to know why is it? Because that's that sense of that desire to know, right? That Aristotle would say at the beginning of metaphysics, right? All men by nature desire to know, right? And yet, of course, we've often so beaten down that natural desire to know. So what are some maybe things from Percy or from yourself that we could do maybe to try to reawaken that desire?
Yeah. So the one thing, it's funny, the way he talks about an indifference more subversive than hostility is actually the phrase that he uses to talk about the sort of the dangers, the real dangers posed to Christianity today is a sort of indifference. The simple one, right, is to read. And it seems so basic, but, you're like George Washington. Yeah, obviously he's the guy who crossed whatever river at whatever time. He's got the wig on, whatever. Did he chop down a cherry tree? Who knows? Oh, that's Abe Lincoln, And we have this idea of who George Washington is. And then we read a biography of George Washington, and it kind of makes that name strange for us. It kind of signifies again, right? We can begin to see, quote unquote, or perceive this person for who he actually was, and not sort of this calcified image of this person. So the other thing is we have to be careful with the effects of the educational apparatus, is what he calls it. So the way, of course not here at Ave Maria, but the way that school typically proceeds, right, is it has this sort of atmosphere of you're supposed to see this thing or that thing about whatever it is that we're investigating. So we're reading Shakespeare, and there's the official approach to Shakespeare, and we're supposed to get this out of it, and then we take the test and we say this is what Shakespeare is saying. Or we dissect the dogfish is the example that Percy uses, and the person is watching us dissect it, and it's this is what I'm supposed to be seeing, and then I have to go regurgitate it on a test. For him, he's like, where's the best place to discover the dogfish or Shakespeare? Well, it's probably in the ruins. It's probably where that sort of educational atmosphere of you're supposed to be seeing something isn't there, and you can kind of see the thing for what it is. And so what is the way of sort of recreating that? Well, you don't want to necessarily induce a catastrophe or go maroon yourself on an island so you can discover Shakespeare. But it's just an attentiveness, a sort of awareness to when we're teaching and when we're learning, the idea that I'm supposed to be learning, I'm drawing attention to the sort of learning environment versus the sort of phenomenon that's right before me. Yeah.
Professor Michael Marsali, one of the founding professors in mathematics at Ave Maria University, would often just say that, don't let school get in the way of your education.
That's right.
And I think it's we have to kind of encounter the world. And I think you can, again, certain other things you can sometimes people also, even when they're encountering, say, the gospel or going through catechism, it's it can also be that same thing. Instead of really discovering and being overwhelmed by the person of Jesus Christ and making a decision to follow him, it's more okay, wait a second, what's being taught and what am I supposed to know? What is the answer I can say that will please the people around me? And what am I supposed to feel? And I don't know, I don't even, and it's this is that kind of, we're in that secondary level and we're not kind of in the primary. And of course we can't get to the primary without the secondary because we need to have other people that teach us and all these sorts of different things. But it is a different, I don't remember the name of the essay. I'm sure you would know it, but it's where he talks about going to the Grand Canyon. It might be the mistake of the loss of the creature, but he says the person who discovered the Grand Canyon was overwhelmed. That was amazing. But he says now everyone, when you go to the Grand Canyon, you've already seen pictures of it. You've already heard about it. So you already have a stock image in your head. And so you kind of then, when you see it, you're like, I don't know. Yeah, I was thinking it'd be a little bit better. Or, this is actually better than I thought. But it's we're, how do we re-encounter the world? in a certain sense. How do we recover wonder? And I definitely think you're right in some ways. Well, one thing would be to begin by doing things like genuinely entering into reading. It reminds me, C.S. Lewis in the Screwtape Letters at one time says, of course, that book is written from the perspective of kind of the devil's trying to tempt Christians away from Christianity. But he says at one time, the most dangerous thing you could have ever done is let him read a book he really enjoys, right? It's okay if he's reading books merely to look fashionable, if he's merely trying to please other people. But the moment you start reading for genuine enjoyment and wonder, like that person's very close to God. So we got to be very careful. So let's go ahead and we'll take a break. And when we get back, I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you got interested in studying Walker Percy. And I've always loved this one essay that he wrote called The Message in the Bottle. So it's actually one of his books right here. That's by the same title. So I'd love to dive into that and think, what is it about that book that he thinks articulates a question and an answer, right, that really makes Christianity understandable, like it becomes intelligible again. And we move out of that kind of indifference, worse than contempt, but now a kind of reacquaintance with the good news.
For sure.
Sounds good.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University and sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle. Through their generous donations of $10 or more per month, Annunciation Circle members directly support the mission of AMU to be a fountainhead of renewal for the Church through our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. To learn more, visit avemaria.edu/join. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
You have a new book out, a scholarly book on Walker Percy and the Crisis of Meaning, Communication in the Ruins. Before you say a word about that book, I'd like just maybe, tell us a little bit about how did you get, I think you were studying computer science and Spanish as an undergraduate, and then you ended up getting a master's and a doctorate in rhetoric. So tell us a little bit about your own just personal journey to study.
Sure, yeah. So the my intellectual journey, I went to school. I went to the University of Mount Union, and it's only after the fact I realized I really got a tremendous education there. And one thing that I studied while I was there was, of course, communication, because it's very pragmatic. Why do I go to school? It's obviously just to get a job, And then I started taking Spanish courses because I was like, yeah, might as well. I like learning about language. And when I was taking Spanish, I started reading literature. So we read like Jorge Luis Borges, who's this sort of like crazy Christopher Nolan of, Argentinian fiction. And I was like, well, might as well make that a major. And so I got a computer science and a Spanish degree. When I graduated, I went to work for my dad's company. And I did marketing for a couple of years. And I learned so much about working with people. And as I was working there, I came across this book. I can't even tell you where it fell out of the sky, how it got in my lap, but Lost in the Cosmos by Walker Percy.
And what's the subtitle of that?
The last self-help book. Yeah. So he was saying something in that book that I thought was so true. He was making fun of self-help books, but in a way that was true and that was actually helpful. So he was like mocking self-help, but helping you in the process, right? So I probably found that book when I was in an existential predicament, wondering what am I supposed to do with my life. And I read the book and I'm like, this is weird and hilarious and also kind of interesting. And the word that he kept using was semiotics. So I was like, well, I want to learn more about what this mysterious thing called semiotics is. So I was living in Pittsburgh at the time, and I just typed in semiotics Pittsburgh. A faculty member's profile came up at Duquesne University, where I went to grad school. I sent him an email. He forwarded my email to the chair of the master's program, or PhD, can't remember at the time. Then I met with them, and then I ended up, the rest is kind of history. I ended up in that master's program. And the program at Duquesne was actually really great because they were really attentive to issues of like scientism and how do we study communication without reducing it to like just a technique or a skill or using quantitative methodology. And there's a place for that, right? Like people use quantitative methods to study human beings. But it was just such a robust, like just full, like, yes, this is what I was looking for. and it just seems so appropriate to our historical moment, and it really appealed to my inner desire to actually know, not to get a degree for credential or for some other end, but no, I really care to know what this thing is. So that's how I got into Walker Percy.
Wow, that's a really that's just a great story. In some ways, it's not unlike, maybe it's different without the getting tuberculosis, but it's a little bit of just you keep but you just keeps looking for more, right? And in some sense, we need to. It is interesting. It's like we somewhat are kind of beings that are somehow oriented outward to somehow discover and know something, and we find ourselves most fully alive when we're knowing, when we're learning, when we're falling in love, right? When we're achieving all these different things, and yet if that horizon is flattened, then it begins to become empty. And so, that sense of recovering that meaning. Now, your book is definitely a scholarly book. You call it, right, Communication in the Ruins, and you go through a number of different understandings of how Percy thinks that there's a kind of consciousness of ourselves that we've inherited from Descartes in modernity that is ultimately false and limiting. And then I love the way, though, as you kind of go through it, you end up getting to the point when the last two chapters, right, are truth and meaning. So after we come up with a better notion of what does it mean to be aware of ourselves, we get to truth. And then the last chapter, right, is on love and meaningfulness. And so anyway, I just love the fact that you kind of follow, in a way, what you were talking about, is that it's only after we go through all this painstaking, hard, scholarly, philosophical work that we can eventually get back to what does it really mean then to find meaning and truth and love.
Right.
So maybe if you could just, for readers, what's a short version of what you do in the book, and of what you what at least it helped you to see and discover?
Sure. Yeah. No. So essentially, the book starts off with a little anecdote that I think most people can relate with. You go into a store and you see somebody and you recognize them, but you don't know their name, and it gives you a little bit of anxiety, and there's some sort of real existential feeling that comes along with this. And it might be on the tip of your tongue, and then finally you realize what their name is, and it brings you joy. And this happens all the time, right? When we forget things. Yeah. But the anecdote is supposed to draw the reader's attention to the fact that there is this intricate connection between naming the world and experiencing joy and wonder, or experiencing anxiety. When we don't know the names for things, especially the names of ourselves, it can create a significant sense of anxiety. Yeah. And so that's kind of how the book opens is, when we know the world, it's not this abstract, Cartesian, disembodied encounter with a world of objects that we're sort of over against. We're in the world, and especially in the world with people, And so basically what it does is it's as it starts off, it kind of tries to unpack these more philosophical terms that Percy uses. And before launching into the sort of second chapter and the sort of main part of the book, it describes what Percy calls C1, C2, and C3 consciousness. So in Lost in the Cosmos, he has this alien talking to an astronaut, and he uses other perspectives. This is one way of sort of defamiliarizing things or making them strange, is to use the perspective of like an animal or like a horse or an alien in this particular case, to reflect upon human nature and what it means to be human. And the alien is basically asking this astronaut, are you C1, C2, or C3? Basically, are you C1, which is Helen Keller discovering that water is water, the sort of primordial, almost Edenic state of Adam naming the world, right? Which is full of wonder and names and discovery. Or are you C2, which is you've fallen into what he calls the pit of yourself. So the world has become sort of stripped of its wonder, and it's just objects and things that I'm over against. There's boredom, there's anxiety, and he draws a lot on sort of 20th century continental philosophy and existentialism to talk about this, but it's the fallen self, right? It's the sort of sinful self. And not just that, but the sinful self that doesn't know its predicament. It doesn't know that there's something wrong, right? So if we experience boredom or anxiety or this sort of restlessness, we begin to look for answers. Where do we go? Of course, we go to science to tell us who or what we are, and who or what are we? Well, we're just very complex, clever animals, and we have very complex. We're more complex animals, but we have needs, just like any other animal has needs, and we need to satisfy those, like Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the last one being self-actualization, right? So that's the second chapter or third chapter of the book is about C2 consciousness, and then the third is. This third stage of consciousness, he says, is you're in a predicament and you know it. And you realize that you need help in getting out of it. And ultimately, what is it that gets you out of your predicament? Well, it's an apostle bearing news from across the seas. And not just that, but an apostle that comes with authority and the means for getting you home. And what those means are the sacraments and the church. But he can't say that because he's always trying to be indirect with his communication. So he uses the image of a castaway, so on and so forth. And we could talk about that at a certain point. And then the book makes a turn into truth and sort of love and the importance of truth and what truth is and how truth is related to language, right? So we need to be able to predicate things. Like if I say overcoat, that might be meaningful or have significance, but uncoupled to something like another word, it can't actually say whether it's true or false. So if I say God, it's like, what do you mean by God? Well, God is love. Okay, we can say that's true or false. And then the last chapter is really on love. And another way of kind of making love signify again, or sort of renewing that term, is to translate it. And so I use C.S. Lewis to kind of help translate love into philia, storge, agape, and eros. Because we think of love today just as a sort of bland, amorphous mass, but there are different types of loves. And that really is significant if we're to have meaning in this world.
That's beautiful, and I'm a big fan of Lewis's book on the four loves, and I really think he is in that book trying to rehabilitate kind of modern man's lack of sensibility that we lack in a way, even really great human friendships or great human eros or great human storge. And so if we don't even, it's hard for even our human loves to be big enough to be rivals of divine love, right? And so he goes through that. But it's also interesting, the way you're describing that sense of anxiety in names, you know, it's fascinating because in many ways the Old Testament is really the revelation of the name of God. What is your name, right? What is your name? Israel asks this of God, or Jacob, who becomes Israel, Jacob asks this of God when he is wrestling with him. Give me your name, right? You know, that I may have your blessing. And Moses gets the name of God, and the temple in the Old Testament is that in which the name of God will dwell. So the Old Testament is really the people that know God's name. They know God's name and they know what they're to do. And then in the New Testament, we see that that name is revealed as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, whom we come to know through Jesus Christ. So Acts 4:12, right? I say it's right. It's in Jesus Christ. There's no other name under heaven that is our salvation. Right? Well, in a certain sense, then, if we've rejected God's name and if we've rejected the name of God revealed in Jesus Christ, then we live in a way profoundly uncertain of who God is, of what the universe is, and in a way of who we are. And we've certainly lost any of the, you know, we've become somewhat lost, right? And so therefore, it's not surprising in a way that we have a deep sense of anxiety and stress and kind of just are overwhelmed. Right? As he puts it, we're lost in the cosmos. And the irony is we don't even know we're lost.
That's right.
Because we've convinced ourselves that we can't name God because there is no God, right? So anyway, it's really fascinating to see that. It's also reminded me, I was thinking of this line from John. It says, when in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, that God is fundamentally, in a way, language, speech, communication, love from all eternity. So let's turn to this famous essay, The Message in the Bottle. So would you just give us a brief kind of
Sure.
a brief description of what's he describing,
Mhm.
and how does he think it helps us to kind of, to see ourselves and to see our situation better?
Yeah, so essentially, he's describing the difference between scientific knowledge and faith as a type of knowledge. And he does
Okay.
think faith is a type of knowledge. And again, he's at pains to talk about the merits of scientific knowledge, which he calls knowledge. The Latin would be sub specie aeternitatis, or the knowledge that holds good and true for all times and all places. So water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Okay, so that's just going to hold good and true no matter where you're at. I mean, I guess if you're in Denver or whatnot, it might be a little bit different. But then there's knowledge that's news, rather, that is relative to your predicament. So if you're a castaway in a deserted island, it may or may not be helpful to know that water boils at a certain temperature, but it certainly is significant to your predicament as a castaway if there is fresh water in the cove just on the other side of the island. So
Yes.
that knowledge or that news is relative to you as an individual, right? And so he's kind of making this distinction between scientific knowledge, which is helpful. Gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared, so on and so forth. And knowledge that is like, here I am in a battle and I get news that reinforcements are coming, or, it speaks directly to me. So
Yeah. I also think it's interesting when he describes that, he speaks about, right, the man who's a castaway on an island, but this is the one unique thing about him, right, is he doesn't remember where he came from. He doesn't remember that he's a castaway. So he wakes up and he finds it's an interesting island. They have some universities, some jobs, right? He's a sensible guy, willing to work, so he makes a life of himself. He gets an education, he gets married, has a little family, right? And then when he goes on the island, he sees on the beach, he walks, he sees these messages in the bottle, right? And they give the stuff, and he begins to classify some as knowledge. They're simply just statements of fact, but other ones are news. So why does he use this image of a castaway who doesn't know he's a castaway?
Essentially it's us, right? So it's like, this is the Earth is the island that we're on, and the news from across the seas is basically, hold tight, you're going to be saved, or somebody is coming to help you, somebody's coming to your assistance.
Yeah.
And if we look at that, we make the sort of category mistake of going, this is knowledge under the aegis of eternity. We would go, well, it's empirically unverifiable. I can't see that. I can't empirically test that. But as I would say to students sometimes, if I were to run into the room and go, well, there's a fire outside or something like that. Of course, I'm not going to break the First Amendment or whatnot. But they don't see it. They have to take my word for it. So there's this element of faith as a sort of trust in a person, and what they're telling you that you can't see, that you have to take their word for it, right? And so who is the news bearer? It's the apostle, right? Percy said that it's funny that the person who had the most influence on me, a Catholic, is some Dutch Protestant, Søren Kierkegaard. He said that Kierkegaard's on the difference between a genius and apostle was probably the most important for him in terms of his Christianity, because Kierkegaard makes a difference between the genius who has knowledge under the aegis of eternity, who's saying something that's universal and true, versus the apostle, who is saying something relative to your predicament. And the question is, which one is bringing you more important news, or telling you something more important? With all due respect to St. Paul, Kierkegaard says, and compared to Shakespeare and Plato, what he says is not so much the aesthetic merits of what he's saying, but the authority he comes with that is of significance.
Yeah, and I think one thing that Kierkegaard also says in that essay is that, like, what the genius comes to see, once the genius sees it and shows it to us, we can all then kind of see it for ourselves, right? So I can't see what Einstein said, but a lot of decent physicists who are nowhere near as smart as Einstein can see it and understand it now. Whereas with the apostle, you always remain in that I have to, like, the promise is that this man whom was crucified has risen again, rose, not only from the dead, but ascended unto heaven and will come again, and that God has put things right.
That's right.
Right? And we remain in that same position. We either believe it or not, right? And I think it's one thing that Percy suggests then is ultimately we need more than messages in a bottle, right? He says we need somebody who delivers the message.
Who comes and speaks with authority, and why do we believe the apostle? Well, he comes with a sober demeanor, and he tells us this is the way it is, and he comes with authority. And not only that, he doesn't come just by himself. This is where he parts ways with Kierkegaard, at least in one regard, is he brings the means with him, right? So he brings the sacraments, the means of sort of journeying on the way. Percy's understanding of the human person, following the Catholic philosopher Gabriel Marcel, is homo viator, man the traveler, man on the way, sort of man on a journey. And when you start to study his sort of understanding of language and communication, he's very weary of the fixity of labels. So like fixing myself as this thing or that thing, because I'm always on my way. I'm always either moving towards God or away from God. And I tell students when I teach Walker Percy, I get the chance to teach him in my interpersonal communication class. I teach Lust in the Cosmos. I say you can't fix yourself, and there's a double meaning to that. I mean, you can name yourself, which is a sort of fixing of yourself, but who knows, whether or not I will be this thing or that thing in the future. And also at the more sacramental level and the level of grace, you can't fix yourself. So Percy is reminding us and trying to show us things about the importance of news as what he calls the most important category of communication.
And I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, he also mentions one other item, which is that is there a kind of, kind of resonance between the news and my deeper longings, right? Is there something where the man's happy on the island, but he's not totally happy on the island. It's fun to have a job. It's fun to have a family. It's fun to have a car, maybe, a car in a garage. But he asks himself, is there something more, right? Maybe there's something more to my life than the life I have on the island. And if he thinks that, then the news that someone is coming to rescue him is amazing, right?
That's
and
right.
so there's this way in which, and I think we have to kind of, and I think if people really look at it seriously, it is interesting how, in some ways this becomes an argument against Christianity, is it so perfectly fulfills our deepest longings that we must have made it up. Right?
That's right. Or it's just some sort of projection.
Yeah, exactly. But of course, what if it fulfills our deepest longings because we were actually made not to live on this little island, but we were made for a communion, right, with God. And so, right, the good news that we have that this man rose from the dead and will come back and defeat our enemies, defeat the enemies of death, right, defeat the enemies of sin, and restore us to communion with God is actually, like, it somehow, it fits, right? So could you say a little bit about that sense that, the trust in the authority of the apostle is not a blind trust. It's not a belief in the absurd, but it actually is somehow like it's wise. It gives wisdom, and it actually allows us, ironically, to understand the island even better than those on the island can understand it.
That's right. Yeah, you realize that you are a castaway. The way that he sort of paraphrases Kierkegaard, I think it's the opening epigraph to the 1962 book that he wrote, The Moviegoer, which is what he's usually known for, is the worst character. The character of despair is precisely this: not knowing that you're in despair. And so it's the posture of the castaway to be receptive to the news is really important, because otherwise, like as you're saying, you just go along to get along, be a bump on the log. You don't even realize that you are a castaway, and somebody can bring you something that there's this appetite that would actually satisfy within you. So how do you stir people into an awareness that they are a castaway? Well, for Walker Percy, you use literally every trick in the book that you possibly can. Of course, observing moral and ethical standards. He wants to attack the fake in the name of the real. All those who would presuppose to give the ultimate answer.
So for maybe, if there's a listener who's interested in learning a little bit more about Walker Percy, we've talked about the essay, The Message in the Bottle. You've talked about which is in the book, The Message in the Bottle, but it's a short, like maybe 15-page essay. There's also, you said, Lost in the Cosmos, which is a short section within the book. Lost in the Cosmos is...
There's he calls it the semiotic primer, which is more philosophical. But I would tell people, start with Lost in the Cosmos.
Okay.
It's my favorite of Percy's books. It's hilarious. It's still very apropos to today. The objects of his mockery and satire, the sort of self-help gurus, they're all still out there. They're all still doing really well. You would have to kind of understand who's, the Donahue Show. He makes some references that might be, out of touch, or people might not understand. And of course, Percy, occasionally he'll say things that are a little bit explicit, so just fair warning to people. But it's so funny and it's so good. So Lost in the Cosmos is a great place to start. But then The Message in the Bottle. And the other one, which people don't talk about as much, is Signposts in a Strange Land, which again are collections of essays. There are book reviews in that. But yeah, he's if you're looking for something more philosophical, not one of his novels, definitely start there.
Sounds good. And I'd like to ask you 3 quick questions. Sure. What's a book you've been reading?
Earlier today, I was actually reading more Aquinas. I need to actually, I want to get my philosophical chops better. I want to actually stand on solid ground. Percy was a Thomist. The great 20th century Catholics who are talking about communication had that sort of Thomistic background. Marshall McLuhan, what have you. So this morning I was reading an excerpt on Aquinas' commentary on Aristotle's On Interpretation. So
excellent. Yeah. That's great. And what's a daily practice you do to draw closer to God?
So right now I'm doing the Bible in a year. It's part of the Founder Scholarship program here, reading the Bible with students. So I've been reading that, and I've been trying, typically after I read the Bible, I go through sort of Carmelite method of, reflecting on God's love for us and then making sort of resolutions. This is what I want to do to grow in virtue and to sort of demonstrate my love for God. So those are the 2 things right now, is just reading the Bible and then praying thereafter.
Thank you for sharing that. And just last question, what's a belief you held about God that you discovered was false? And what was the truth you discovered?
Belief about God. Well, I wasn't always a believer. So I converted to Catholicism in 2014. I entered the church. I tried a lot of different things. I was reading atheism, went the Buddhism route. In fact, I was the guy probably Walker Percy was making fun of, sort of searching around the island, picking up different bottles and, drinking whatever's in the bottle or following the instructions on this or that bottle. But, when it comes down to brass tacks, you can think about God intellectually, and I love, thinking about God. But why love God, and why believe that God is who he says he is? For me, and I was just having this conversation with somebody the other day, he reveals himself as in a father-son relationship, in a familial relationship. And that to me, just thinking about my own father and the times that I have suffered in my life, feeling the closeness of God, which some people say, well, that's just, it's just subjective. That to me is what has really strengthened my faith and made me want to believe, is that presence of God, the real presence of God that is hard to articulate, it's hard to quantify, it's hard to empirically validate for others, but the real presence of God in suffering has meant the most to me.
Wow. Well, what a beautiful place to finish. So again, we've been speaking with Professor Justin Bonanno, Professor of Communications, and also helps with mentoring a bunch of students at Ave and teaching many. We're so grateful to have you here with us, and appreciate just kind of maybe knowing a little bit more about Walker Percy, one of the great 20th century Catholic converts and really apologists, as well as a novelist and philosophical essayist. So thank you again for your work, and thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.